I want to welcome the Minister here and welcome her back to active duty. I also want to move the amendment in my name, which is to postpone the consideration of the second stage until the end of the year. But I want to do it on this basis only, that it was only proposed on the basis that we aren't going to rush this thing through. And if I have satisfactory assurances that we're not going to rush it through, then I don't particularly want to push that amendment towards the end of the second stage debate. Yeah. So there's a number of things I want to say. Senator Ward, in a bullion style, and decided to commence his contribution here on the basis that most of the criticism of this bill was nonsense. Well, I don't accept that, and I don't accept that. I accept that much of the criticism of this bill is nonsense, and that a lot of keyboard warriors have written exaggerated and overblown criticisms of the bill and the threat it is to our society. I accept that proposition. But when the Irish Council of Civil Liberties says that there are problems with this bill which haven't yet been addressed, it's not nonsense to say that we must consider it very carefully. And when there are other faults with the legislation which appear to some of us, at any rate, to be serious faults, then I don't think it's fair to dismiss the matter as nonsense. Senator Pauline O'Reilly said that, all rights can be limited in the interest of the common good. That isn't the test. The Constitution is different. The Constitution actually guarantees rights. And what this House believes about the common good is not the test as to the extent to which those rights can be curtailed. And in particular, in relation to the freedom of speech and the free expression of views, it is only subject to public order and morality. That is the test. And you may want to have a kinder society, as Senator Eileen Flynn spoke about. You may want to have a better society, a society where we're kinder and more decent to each other. Those things are undoubtedly part of the common good, but they do not justify. They do not justify. A kind society is not, and a moral society are not necessarily the same thing. I'm telling you that. You can be unkind, offensive. Free speech sometimes is offensive to other people, and people legitimately cause offence and take offence from free speech. And it is a guarantee of free speech without the right to offend has been on many occasions described by people right across civilization as worthless. And the same applies to minority opinions. Now, the second thing I want to say about this is that this legislation proposes to criminalise some behaviour, and in particular, Section 7 says that if you behave in a public place that is likely to incite violence or hatred against a person or persons on account of their protected characteristics, and you do so with intent to incite violence or hatred against such a person, or reckless as to whether your behaviour will cause that kind of reaction, you're liable to be, you commit an offence which is punishable by 5 years imprisonment. And as a result of that, two things happen under the Criminal Law Act of 1997. A member of An Garda Síochána can arrest you and detain you and bring you to a Garda station where you can be detained under the provisions of the Criminal Justice Act of 1984. And secondly, any citizen can arrest you if he or she believes that you are actually committing an offence under the section. So to create such an offence without actually it being clear to everyone what is or is not constituted by the term hatred is very dangerous indeed. Because some people may say, this behaviour, say outside a synagogue, was calculated to cause hatred to the Jewish population who were using their synagogue. And an attempt an arrest, or a member of An Garda Síochána may do so in the same circumstance. And we are here putting in place the legal basis for those arrests to be carried out and for detention of people to happen on the basis of the view taken as to whether there is reasonable cause in the mind of an ordinary citizen or a member of an Garda Síochána that they are witnessing the commission of an offence under this Act. Now, is it reasonable to accept the word of two Attorneys General that it would complicate things if we attempt to define the term hatred? And as a former Attorney General myself, I see that it probably would complicate prosecution. And it would possibly do what the Minister said it would do, make it more difficult to prosecute in some cases. And why would it do that? If you define hatred as being a particular level of intense opprobrium or disgust or some other formula which was proposed in Dáil Éireann, are you saying that something less than that will suffice for hatred? I mean, in the last analysis, if a definition of hatred is provided, a judge is going to determine whether the prosecution has or has not established it. But to say to members of An Garda Síochána, to members of the public who have a power of arrest, to say to them, I don't want to define hatred because everyone knows what it means, is a very bold statement to make indeed. And the funny thing is, it's not just me that's saying that. The United Nations Human Rights Commission has specifically stated that if you're going to criminalise incitement to hatred, that you should define the term hatred and indeed the term incitement. And I mean, this is part of what are called the Rabat Plan of Action, which was adopted in October 2012. So it's not just me saying, I want a definition of hatred. Hatred is something which could mean an awful lot to an awful lot of different people. I mean, Senator Flynn spoke recently about the necessity for this legislation by reference to a particularly repugnant incident in which he was involved in relation to a taxi journey. But was there hatred involved? She might have thought there was hatred by the driver towards her. But on the other hand, is it an objective test? And at what stage should a judge say, this is what the legislature meant when it prohibited behaviour likely to incite hatred? There are other points that I want to make and will make in the course of, and I intend to put down a fair few amendments, because I also want to stress one thing, Minister. The 1989 Act is clearly past its sell-by date. It's not because there haven't been enough prosecutions under it, but because it belongs to a different era where it's to do with what happens in public spaces and outside the home and doesn't take into account the internet at all. And I do accept that we must now modernise our law to stop rabid anti-Semitism being spread via the internet with a view to causing hatred against Jews and other religious and racial minorities. But can I say one thing about this? Every time I hear people talking about hatred and violence and the like, I haven't heard many of the NGOs who complain about this talking about the violence and threats of violence that are levelled at people like Mary Kenny, the journalist, the threat of violence if she went to Limerick to speak to the students, the riot squads that have to be deployed to protect some people because they want to exercise their right of free speech. And, violence and the threat of violence, and I echo what Senator Mullen said, in the days of a cancel culture, violence and the threat of violence is not a one-way street. The amount of vile vituperation against people by members of minorities and protected minorities, and a self-appointed spokesman for particular varieties of protected minorities, launched anonymously at people who they say are homophobes, transphobes, and the like on the media, on the social media, are significant. And I don't hear protestations that they need protection from anybody. They're only being attacked, whether they're authors or lecturers or whatever, they're only being attacked for expressing a view, say, on the subject of transgender, and as to whether it is or is not a viable concept. They're only being attacked for their views on that matter. In the most trenchant terms, they're being cancelled. They're near riots if they go to speak in places, hotel meetings being held in secret lest they be disrupted. And who is standing up to speak for freedom of speech? And if we bring in a law which says that somebody stands up in public and a member of An Garda Síochána or a member of the public who has a camera and takes a clip of what has been said, has the right to detain that person. Who is going to say that there isn't going to be a chilling effect, especially when there are people who will actually resort to violence to prevent people articulating a view hostile to theirs? Now, in the last half minute that I have, I just want to say this. This bill needs to be amended. It isn't in good shape. It emerged from the Dáil Éireann on a wave of generalised support. And it has come before us in a state where it can be a charter for freezing genuine free speech and prevent people from articulating unpopular views, such as J.K. Rowling's views, or whatever they are. She's entitled to express her views and not to be arrested by a citizen or by a guard. And the whole idea of saying, oh, well, when it comes to court, she'll have all her protections. Going to court to defend your remarks in public and being acquitted is a pretty horrific experience for most people. And most people will take many, many steps to avoid the danger of being prosecuted and shut their mouths. And it's been referred to in this House by Deputy Chambers, or Senator Chambers, that people in this House feel constrained about what they can say on certain topics because on both sides outside there is such a violent reaction on the social media and in the conventional media. So I want to say this. I have no objection to this bill being brought forward because the 1989 legislation is in need of radical overhauling. I have no objection to a bill preventing the abuse of free speech to create a violent threat against minorities in our society. But this bill must be gone through line by line and with huge care to ensure that it doesn't have the effect of having people dragged before courts by citizens and members of An Garda Síochána who have a particular view of what is or is not hatred because we were too lazy to define our terms. Thank you.